Welcome back to the Tommy Brideson Show. I wanted to talk and discuss the differences between RPE, percent-based training programs, and RIR. Now, let's first chat about what they are and how they differ, and then we'll look at the implications of how they work into training programs, and then how you can use them in your training program, whether you're looking at it from a coaching standpoint or you're looking at it from an end user standpoint. Now, when you're looking at training, the first thing is it's a bit of a subjective world. So all of these training parameters are looking at creating a little bit of objectivity around the training process itself. And what it is from a coaching side of things, what they are is they're essentially allocating an intensity range that they want you to stay and work within. So as example, if I wanted you to work one set of one rep at 90%, I've dictated that I want you to work at 90%. If you're looking at doing one set of one rep at a 9 RPE, you're looking at it around 90% also. So the parameters are roughly the same. It's just a different way of looking at it. Now, obviously a percent-based training program is very specific. We're working on a specific number, where an RPE-based training program is looking at it from, okay, we have a subjective feeling. We're going to look at how it moved. We're going to know how it felt, and then we're going to allocate an RPE to it. But really the outcome is the same. We're looking at keeping the intensity and the load of your training within a certain window. Now, RPE, what it is, rate perceived effort or exertion. Now, what this is creating a scale where you're allocating how many more reps you think you could do at the end of that set. So how it looks, a 10 RPE is you could do no more reps, a 9 RPE is you could do one more rep, and 8 RPE you could do 2 more reps, and so on. That's how that works. RIR is exactly the same principle but flipped on its head. So 1 RIR is essentially you could do one more rep. 2 RIR is essentially you could do 2 more reps. So you're leaving 2 more reps in reserve at the end of each set. So the list goes on. Then with percentage-based programming, you have a fixed allocated number based off either a working max or your actual 1 RM. But all of those systems, when you use them, they are all keeping you within a window and an intensity range so that you can build momentum in your training programs and you can build and work through an intensity that's going to be conducive to long-term progress. Now, when you have a look at an actual training program itself, every program actually has RPE-based training built into it just automatically. Because if you come into a training program and say I had set numbers in my program and I came in and it was way too heavy as I was warming up, I'm going to auto-regulate that training program load just based off how it feels. So intuitively, you're going to be using RPE regardless. So every single training program has to have this overarching guide of we are using some sort of auto-regulation tool, which is RPE. Now, you can get caught up on the nuances between RPE and RIR. I blend them together. They're really the same thing. They're just flipped in reverse. Now, people will sort of, comment on the nuances between the difference between them, but at the end of the day, all it's doing is saying how many more reps you could do at any particular set. So when we're looking at training, using like a RPE, RIR reserve system is the best way of always over-regulating your training program and making sure that you're working to the intensity that has been prescribed. Now, when you're looking at your training program itself, your main lifts are probably the ones that have the most inbuilt risk. So those ones, you have to put a lot of intention into making sure that you're really working on the technical component, building momentum, and simmering in the direction that you want to go. So those particular movements, in a lot of cases, will have a dictated number associated to them. So say you have been lifting for 5 years and you have very well-established numbers, a lot of the time coaches will give their lifters either a set number or a range to work within. But a lot of the programming these days will then also allow you to add in an RPE, which will then predict an estimated 1 RM. And then off that estimated 1 RM, in a lot of cases, there will be working sets based off that, off a set fixed percentage. So you can start to see how RIR, RPE, and percentage-based programs all work together in the one. So when you're looking at any particular training program, there's always a combination of this going on. And if you look at the main lifts, for instance, so say your A1 and your B1, a lot of the time, these are exercises that have more sort of fixed numbers or ranges associated with them. And then your accessory exercise and your supplementary exercises towards the end of your training programs are really more based on that RPE and that RII sort of scale, because you might not know what your 1RM for your bicep curl is, but you know what weight you could do and how hard you could push it for a certain amount of reps before you get close to failure. Now, if we look at different sort of like populations and different groups of people, right? If you've got someone brand new into the gym, you don't have any established training 1RMs, you have very little training experience, you have no way to predict or estimate what your 1RMs are. So it's unrealistic to use a percentage-based program in that instance. And, to be completely honest with you, some trains of thoughts are you go and you do a testing day and then you determine what an estimated 1RM is, and then you kind of work off that as a baseline. But for me, there's actually too much inherent risk built in that. So I would actually much rather use more of an RPE-based model for a newer lifter, because what that's going to do, it's as they gain progress, as they gain understanding, as their technique gets better, they develop that body awareness. What's going to happen is they're going to instantaneously be able to add more and more weight to the bar. Now, the thing with that is you're going to allow them to progress at the speed at which they can actually progress at. You're not going to hold them back. And as they get more, dialed in on what they're doing, they're just going to get better and better and better and better and better. And they're going to get to their new benchmark very, very soon. So using an RBE-based model for them will allow them to actually progress, get their strength up, and move through their training program in a much more seamless way. So say, for instance, you were week one of a training program for a beginner lifter, and you came in and you were doing sets of 5. You could simply just do ramping sets. So a set of 5, a set of 5, a set of 5, a set of 5, until you find a weight that is of the RPE that has been prescribed. Now, that RPE, in all honesty, is not actually going to be that accurate, because that particular lifter wouldn't actually really know what a true RPE is. But based on the effort and the output of that particular session, they can start to get a little bit of an understanding of what RPE is, how hard to push, and then that's going to help build the sort of layers around how they're going to progress their training. At a later point in their training, they may then progress to something a little bit different where they have more fixed numbers, percentage-based programs. But at the start, for a beginning lifter or someone that's coming back from a rehab standpoint, basically you want to start with an RPE base to, oversee your entire training program to keep you within an intensity. Now, talking about rehab and talking about sort of injuries, when you come back from an injury, say for instance, my max squat is 200 kilos and you're coming back from an injury, but you've been plagued with knee pain, you have no idea how much weight you can handle in that particular movement pattern without knee pain coming back. So logically, it makes sense to use a different framework than a fixed percentage-based program. So in that instance there, you would use an RPE scale, which took into account your technique, how the weight felt, the training load itself, and your pain response. So then that's one way that you can then modulate how hard you're pushing and then keep yourself within a certain range of intensity. So, from a rehab standpoint, it makes a lot of sense to be using that as well. Now, if you've got someone that, say, for instance, had a tendinopathy or they needed to get some work in and get some sets and reps in, and you were encouraging a little bit of discomfort during the training process, but not pushing too hard, you might say, okay, in terms of RPE, I want you to push till you get to a 3 RPE of pain. So once you get to that point, I want you to stop, do a couple of sets at that weight, and then not progress the weight any further. And as the injury or the niggle that you're dealing with starts to subside and settle down, you can then ramp up the intensity and work at an RPE that allows you to do so without pain, staying within that pain range window. So when you're looking at RPE-based training, you've got to take into account the actual training load itself, but you've also got to take into account your training technique and any pain that you have involved in the movement, if you have any pain involved in the movement. And, quite often I'll see people put up like posts on Instagram and they'll say, that was a 6 RPE with a misgroove, which looked like a 9 RPE. So for me, that just shows a bit of a miscommunication between their understanding of what an RPE is and their output. Because the reality is, if you misgroove something and it moves like a 9 RPE, it is a 9 RPE. It's not a 6.5 RPE because you suspected it could have moved better. It's based on the actual weight that you've done, the weight that you have moved. So you always have to be looking at it from an objective standpoint. Now, the other really cool thing about RPE-based training is, I spoke about it a little bit earlier, but creating an estimated 1 RM off a subjective input that you put in. So we often call them like indicator sets. So say I was doing squats, we'll just keep it on the same theme, but you were doing squats for that particular day. And you come into a training session and you were prescribed 1 set of 5 reps at a 7 RPE. Now, based off that particular day, say I inputted it and I said that was a 6.5 or a 6 RPE. That's going to predict an estimated 1 RM for me. Then all of my working sets that I'm doing after that indicator set, all that top set, are basically going to be based off the number of that estimated 1 RM. Now, the cool thing about that is, if you are working off an RPE-based system, on the days that it's feeling good, you can push it up a little bit and you can work at the intensity that your body is capable of working at. And on days that you're not having like a particularly great day on the gym floor, you can very easily pull the load and intensity back and still get a really constructive training session in without driving yourself into the ground and feeling like you've had a failed session. Now, I am very biased towards when you've got lifters that you have very definitive and defined 1 RMs for. I am very biased towards giving either a set number or a range, because I know what their lifts are at. I know what they're capable of lifting, and I know if they hit certain numbers, they're on track to then progress and make more progress further down the track. So I am very biased towards doing that. But the reality is that the RPE is always the overarching principle involved in this, because I always say to people is, don't get obsessed with a number that's on the actual training program itself. What you want to be doing is going, okay, as you're warming up, assessing, engaging how your body's reacting to the load, how you're warming up, how it's feeling, and then make decisions based off that. If you come into a training session and you're warming up and your second last warm up, for instance, is a 9 RPE, but you're meant to be doing a 7 RPE, you're not going to continue to go up. You're just going to adjust the load on that particular session and have a really constructive session. So that could just be an off day, or it could be that the training program, the intensity that's been prescribed is actually too high, right? So I am more biased to that I'm more biased to prescribing numbers for people when they have more defined numbers to work with. But when someone is newer to the gym, or someone is coming back from a rehab journey, working their way back up into the gym and progressing through, the better approach is actually to be looking at a RPE-based model, because it's going to allow them to progress and pull back as needed during that journey. Because at the end of the day, training is just an accumulative effort of session after session after session that builds up a savings account that makes you better over time. So there is never one session that is ever a defining moment in your training. And, having that overarching lens of RPE in your training allows you to make, the ebbs and flows in your training process while still moving forward in a really constructive way. Now, when we have a look at accessory exercises and supplementary exercises a little bit further down the train, in your training program, what you will notice with those particular exercises are quite often you're pushing a lot harder or a lot further to your failure point with them. So quite often you'll see, an 8 RPE or a 2 RIR or a 9 RPE or a 1 RIR with no percentages or no fixed numbers in there. And that's because a lot of these exercises, they don't require as much stability and effort and output neurologically than the main lifts, say your A1 and your B1 do. Now, what that means is you can kind of get yourself strapped into a machine. You could get on a hack squat, you could get on a leg extension or a hamstring curl, And because you're supported externally, you can really push the intended target muscle groups really close to failure, get a really good response that's going to have like a hypertrophy adaptation, and it's going to add to the system as a whole. And it's not going to put you at risk of a potential injury. So what you'll often find is with the exercises further down the train, it's higher in terms of the intensity, but it's warranted. It's necessary to get the adaptations that you want from hypertrophy. Because at the start of your training programs, you're working more on the skill, more on the neurological side of things, and also developing strength that you need to build upon to get better and better and better. But then down towards the end, you're training all the supporting muscle groups, which really respond well to pushing closer to that failure point. So I don't think I've ever seen a training program with a fixed number for an accessory exercise in terms of like a percent. But so what you'll usually see is an RPE or an RIR. Now, I think it's important to note with RPE based training that it comes in ebbs and flows, because you might come off the back of a deload, for instance, and you've just had a week off training, and quite often coming off the back end of a deload, your nervous system's quite down-regulated. So coming back into week one, logically in your head, you think, hey, I should be feeling really, really fresh. I should be feeling, pretty upregulated, ready to go. But quite often it takes you a couple of weeks to get into the flow of a training program. So in the first week of any particular training program, even if you have a set number there, what I often like to do is think about it like this, because a lot of the time you have new exercises as well. So week one of a particular training program, just use it as an opportunity to find or define a start point for that particular training point. So say, for instance, I had a safety bar squat and I hadn't done a safety bar squat for 6 weeks. I've just come off the back of a deload, I'm down regulated, and I'm not overly familiar with this particular exercise, for the last few weeks. So you can just do ramping sets where you do a set of 5 or 6, whatever's prescribed, up until a certain point where you hit that RPE. Once you've hit that RPE, you found a start point for that particular program, and it's just your base point, which then successive weeks you can then just start to add layers to. Now, what you'll often find is in that first week, you'll find a number, and the second week, you'll be able to make a big jump from that, the week one numbers to the week two numbers, just from the familiarity, from your nervous system being upregulated, and from you being in the flow of things again. So it's a really good tool to use, even if you have a fixed number in there, because sometimes it takes a little bit of time to familiarize yourself with exercises. Sometimes it's a completely new variation of exercise that you haven't done before, and you have no benchmark, of what you should be lifting for that particular exercise. And, you want to progress that exercise as quick as you can and get it towards the RPE that you need to be hitting, but you also don't want to overshoot it too soon. And then the cool thing about the RPE is you can progress it as able, because there's no sort of cap or there's no limit on it. So, back when I first started coaching, I was actually really preference towards fixed numbers. And I used to, try and either guesstimate or get someone to do testing, like I spoke about before, to find kind of a 1RM, or I'd simply just pick an endpoint that I'd get someone to work from and just reverse engineer it and work them back. But I think, the development and the education and the understanding around RPE is actually one of the best tools for, one, to make training progress, but two, also is injury prevention. Because when you think about it is, if you come into a particular training session and you're working, way above the capacity that you have the ability to handle, and you're overshooting way too much, with an RPE-based program, you have the ability just to pull it back. So if you have a set percentage-based program, sometimes what happens is, as someone that really wants to push and they want to show up and do their best and put their effort their best into their training program, they don't want to deviate from what has been prescribed, because they'll feel like it's a failed session or a failed program. So if 100 kilos was inputted into the actual training program itself, they're like, well, I need to do 100 kilos. But the reality is, any coach that's prescribed anything to you, really, there's always an overarching RPE because they want you to be making progress. They want you to be building momentum, but they want you to be doing it in a way that's constructive to long-term progress. Now, some of the common issues that I do find with RPE-based training programs is people's gauging of how hard particular sets are. Now, what I would say with that is I think males, for instance, generally overshoot. So they'll do a set and they'll go a little bit high up, but then underscore their RPE, where females will typically do the inverse relationship to that. So they'll come in and they'll input the RPE a lot harder than it actually really was. So you find that it's generally, that's not always the case, but that's just my general observation. So there is a little bit of an onboarding process with RPE. And I think the better you get as a lifter and the more defined you get in terms of like knowing what your true maxes are or what you can hit for certain sets and reps, it does make the RPE game a lot easier to use. But the reality is you actually just need to start training and start using it in order to dictate what these outcomes and these numbers are going to be. And then you just get better and better and better. And you'll get to a certain point, and, I was talking about indicator sets before, but, say for instance, you're warming up to 140 kilo bench, you'll have a number that you bench press on the way up in your warm up that pretty much whether you're having a good or bad day. So that might be 120. You might come in and you go, "Ooh, that moved a little bit slow today." And, say you're in a really tight position and it just didn't feel on. And you can already start to prep yourself for that particular session. So instead of making a really aggressive jump from, say, 120 to 140, you might go, okay, well, I'm going to do a little set in between that. I'm going to go 120 to 130, see how 130 moves, and then I'm going to make my call on what my top set would be after that. So even when you are working with like a fixed percentage-based program, as you're working your way up through the warm-ups and you have these little like testing indicator sets along the way and you go, okay, well, 120, yep, that's normally a 5 RPE for me. Whoa, that felt like an 8 RPE today. You go, okay, well, I'm not going to make my usual jump from 120 to 140. I'm going to slow it down a little bit, see if it was just a misgroove. And if it wasn't a misgroove, I'm going to make a smaller conservative jump, maybe not hit the 140 for that particular set, and then just scale it back and have a really productive session. So, you can see the value in having, this built-in system throughout the actual training process that allows you to undulate when things are feeling good, undulate when things are feeling bad, and bring it down. And the ethos of it all is that you're just having a really constructive session where you can build momentum through your training, because that is the thing that we're doing, because there is no one session that dictates anything. So, you want to have an inbuilt system and you want to build enough self-awareness around, where your strength's at on any particular day, where when you can push and when you can pull back. Now, the thing with RPE is it does take a bit of time to get used to it. But I do feel like it's something that if you really delve into, it is something that it pays dividends to your training, whether you are on a fixed percentage-based program or you are on an RPE-based program, because the reality is you're only as good as the intensity you can put into your training. And the better that you get at understanding what your actual intensity is, the more you can put into your training. And you also then know when to pull back when there are red flags and you go, hey, well, today's not my day. I'm not going to push it. But I know if I come in, I rest up, I get a good constructive session in, and I come back next week and I do that same session again, it's probably going to be pretty good again, like providing there's nothing actually wrong. You're probably going to come in and absolutely smash that session and just know that it was just a session. It wasn't your day on that particular training session. You come in the next week and you absolutely blitz it. So RPE-based training definitely should always be an overarching, but there is such a need for also sometimes keeping people within a certain range. So with percentage-based programs, when you do have really defined numbers, you can keep someone within a very narrow window. If you've got a lifter that chronically overshoots over and over and over again, you might actually have to put a strategy in place and goes, hey, here's your range that you can work within. Do not go any higher than that. That is your training session for this particular day, because you'll have periods of time where you want that person to just simmer, give their body a break, and get some constructive sets and reps in. And you don't want them sitting on the threshold. So that's where a percentage-based program becomes really, really beneficial. But then, say for instance, towards the end of a strength training block, at the end of that training block, you have a little a little bit of inbuilt flexibility in there anyway, especially if you've had a really good off season and you spent, 8, 12 months training and building an epic base, you've filled out your muscle mass, you're feeling really nice and strong. And then you get to the end of your training block, you might find that you've actually made a lot of progress. So we don't know what that progress is yet. So that's where you have a little bit of inbuilt flexibility as well with the RPE based training. So to wrap things up, all training programs should have a combination of RPE or RIR and percent-based program within it to make it a really constructive training program. You might not use all of those at the same time, but somewhere during your training journey, you're going to use a variety of all of them. That's it for me today. I'll see you guys on the next episode.